Welcome to Noon Hour Slides from the Moose Jaw Museum and Art Gallery. We're located on Treaty 4 territory, the traditional lands of the Blackfoot, Cree, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We pay our respects to First Nations and Métis ancestors and reaffirm our relationship with one another. We gratefully acknowledge funding from the City of Moose Jaw, Sask Arts, Sask Culture, Saskatchewan Lotteries, Canada Council for the Arts, Canadian Heritage, and the Government of Canada. I'm Vincent Hotelling, the Administrative Assistant here, and I'm here to welcome you to today's presentation. On behalf of the Saskatchewan History and Folklore Society, Hugh Henry organized 4 long walks in the province: Wood Mountain Post to Fort Walsh in 2015, Swift Current to Fort Battleford in 2017, Original Humboldt to Fort Carlton in 2019, and Fort Ellice to Fort Qu'Appelle in 2021. With supporting images, Hugh will review the history of the trails, how communities were engaged along the way, and the rewarding experience of long walks. Welcome.
I'm going to show images and talk about these 4 walks that are organized as a program of History and Folklore Society. And I'd like to acknowledge that they took place on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territories, lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota, and as you will see, very much the traditional territory of Métis. There are underlying themes to the walks, but not ones that were necessarily planned or stated. Participants experience these things and reflect on them in their own ways during the walk and afterwards. I expect for some years after. First of all, you meet and make connections with other walkers and interesting people along the way. There are physical and psychological experiences when walking on the land. You notice the plants, animals, water, sun, and wind, besides your aches and pains, of course. And there are multiple histories, importantly, Indigenous histories and knowledge of places and perspectives, too often overlooked because of the physical presence of buildings, roads, fields, and other developments. That knowledge has been made evident by Indigenous mentors like Richard, shown here on the first walk, and other mentors that have followed. I hope you'll get a sense of these connections as I talk and show the slides. The first walk lasted 21 days and covered 320 kilometers, and there were 28 participants. The green line here shows a trail that was started by Métis families moving between Wood Mountain and the Cypress Hills as early as the 1860s, after establishing an Evernaut at Wood Mountain. It was later used by the Northwest Mounted Police as its main patrol trail between their posts at Wood Mountain and Fort Walsh. Note the communities of McCord, Mancota, Valmarie, and East End along the route. We scheduled programs there to engage residents with their local history. And I'll talk a bit more about those programs when I show the slides. Here's our start at Wood Mountain Post Provincial Historic Site. The fellow in the green jacket is Matthew. He was a prof at Concordia University in Montreal, and it was his idea to walk this trail, which he knew about from growing up in Swift Current. He contacted Saskatchewan History and Folklore Society, and they put him in touch with me since I was somewhat familiar with the route. The Mounties were from Assiniboia. I had invited a representative to give us a send-off by deputizing Matthew and me as honorary Northwest Mounted Police constables, and to entrust us with a dispatch to Fort Walsh as a bit of a heritage reenactment. All the walks were advertised as come and go to make it as convenient as possible to participate. There were only 6 of us who started, and we reached Wood Mountain First Nation about 1 p.m. It happened to be on the weekend of the AGM and powwow. They welcomed us and invited us in for something to eat. We were also fortunate when an elder offered a smudge in one of the teepees to bless us as we started our journey. After this, there was only 4 of us walking for the first 6 days. This is at 6 Mile Creek, 6 miles from Wood Mountain, and about 8 fences we had to crawl through by that time. It is one of 260 markers that were installed in 1961 and 1962 to mark the trail. And one of the objectives of the walk was to locate markers that had not been recorded in the History and Folklore Society database. The fellow on the right is named Hayden, and he came to Montreal. He came from Montreal with Matthew, and he had never seen the prairies before. Richard, who you saw at the start, was the 4th person in the initial group, and he took this photo, as well as the first one on the screen, and several more that will be used in this presentation. So thank you, Richard. We reached McCord by late afternoon on the second day. Friends of mine from McCord offered to organize a potluck supper. About 45 people showed up and for the program that followed. Now, Matthew taught a class on pilgrimage at Concordia, and he gave a presentation showing images of the walks he had undertaken in Europe and Quebec. Thelma Poirier, a writer and local historian from Glentworth, did a poetry reading. And I showed slides like this one of people from McCord in the 1940s and 1950s. They were taken by Everett Baker, who worked in the co-op movement and was well known in the Southwest. This collection of over 3,000 slides was given to Saskatchewan History and Folklore Society. The next day, we did the same thing at the Senior Drop-In Center in Mankota. We put on the coffee and cookies, but here I used some of Baker's images of Mankota folks. And it was fun having people identify them and add their personal notes. And about 30 people attended this program. I had arranged to camp overnight in people's yards on 8 of the days. Here we are after a long, hot day west from Mankota as guests of the aptly named Walker family. They had supper prepared for us and had invited neighbors over for an evening visit. In order to follow the historic trail as close as possible and locate markers, I got permission from about 20 land stewards to cross pastures. We never did walk on seeded fields. I also invited people to join us on horseback. Here are a couple of friends of mine from Swift Current on Pinto Horse Butte between Mankota and Val-Marie. This is also on Pinto Horse Butte with a marker in the distance. And remarkably, it was still standing straight after about 50 years with all the cattle that would have been rubbing on it in the meantime. Here we are at Prairie Wind and Silver Sage in Val-Marie. Matthew and I did our presentations again, and this time we were joined by Trevor Harriott, who was in the area doing some filming related to community pastures. And that's Trevor seated second from the left side. Trevor and his photographer and a handful of local folks joined us at the start of the next day as we crossed the Val-Marie community pasture. By the end of the day, there was just Matthew and myself, but that only lasted one more day until we were joined by others. This is on the north edge of the Frenchman Valley, south of Shaunavon. And for some of those walkers that were with us 2 summers ago in 2020, you'll recognize the area from our walk that year. I mentioned Everett Baker, but I didn't tell you that it was his idea to mark the trail. Here is a Baker photo from 1961 showing the installation of a marker just west of the one in the previous slide. And as a bit of a side note, on behalf of History and Folklore Society, I organize volunteers to paint and repair these markers on a section of the trail twice every year. There was a lot of evidence of ranching history in the Frenchman Valley. At East End, we took a day off from walking, but we didn't rest. I had arranged several activities for the day and advertised quite widely. We had people come from as far away as Saskatoon and Regina. This slide shows a guided tour of Chimney Coulee, just north of East End. It was the location of an early Métis settlement where Isaac traded for the Hudson Bay Company, and also the location of the first Northwest Mounted Police outpost between Wood Mountain and Fort Walsh. We ended the day with a catered supper at well-known Jack's Cafe, complete with a reading by Candace Savage from her book, The Geography of Blood. And that's Candace on the right-hand side in the pink. The guy with his back to us is Harold. It was his 79th birthday that day, and he turned 85 this past summer and has participated in every walk up to 9 days. In A Geography of Blood, Candace Savage wrote about the indigenous starvation camps at Cypress Lake in the early 1880s. Here is Cypress Lake in a more pleasant light. We camped there overnight, and Richard led a smudge at the lakeshore in the morning. The following day, we walked a 6-mile stretch of pasture on the Cypress Hills bench. We got caught up in the approaching storm and sheltered in a low spot with thunder and lightning close overhead. It passed quickly and we didn't get too wet. Here I am recording the location of a post later that afternoon. It's only about 4 miles southeast of Fort Walsh. You can see the old cart and wagon tracks from 140 or so years ago. We spent the night at a ranch south of Fort Walsh, and the next morning our host showed us the log house that he had grown up in. You can see the original house at the center with wings added on both sides as the family grew. I had arranged for the staff at Fort Walsh to greet us, which they did in style, firing the cannon as a welcome. As a devoted Northwest Mounted Police constable, I presented the commanding officer with a dispatch from Wood Mountain. Here's Matthew again. He'd arranged for a friend at Brockville, Ontario to send him some dirt from Walsh's grave there. He had sprinkled some at the flagpole at Wood Mountain when we started, and here he is leaving the rest of it in front of where Walsh's office once stood at Fort Walsh. Then Richard led a smudge outside the fort walls to complete the walk. Now on to walk number 2 from Swift Current to Battleford on what was known as the Battleford Trail in 2017. Just a bit of historic notes. The railway reached Swift Current in December of 1882, making it the closest rail link to the Battleford district. The first trip between the two settlements was led by a Métis freighter named Goodwin Marchand, who left Battleford in April 1883. This is the heritage marker and original trail ruts at a designated municipal heritage site on the north side of number 1 highway in Swift Current, and that's where we started the walk. The walk was 19 days. We traveled 300 kilometers and 20 people participated at various lengths of time. I invited a good friend and local Métis elder, Cecile, and the local staff sergeant to provide some remarks to about 75 people who came out for the send-off. The Northwest Mounted Police patrolled the trail for several years, so that's why the RCMP connection to that history. The Art Gallery of Swift Current sponsored Métis heritage workshops, including weaving, dancing, and music at the site to coincide with the departure. And the dance instructor is in the middle. The Art Gallery also had a replica Red River cart constructed. The cart with the horse and driver led a procession of about 50 people, young and old, to the north outskirts of the city. And again, Richard led us in a smudge and then we were on our way. That's where the trail crossed the river. Métis families have lived nearby in the early years and played a role in ferry service, mail delivery, and the construction of Goodwin House, seen here. It now serves as staff offices and interpretive center for Saskatchewan Landing Provincial Park. On the north side of the valley, this grandfather was an occasion to offer tobacco. We are having a bit of fun on the grounds of the Kyle Museum. Two days later, we reached Otter Springs, which is one of the overnight stops along the trail. It was named after Colonel Otter, who spent the night there with his troops on the march north in 1885. The spring is still active, and a local family said that Indigenous people still leave offerings there on occasion. So it must have a significance that goes well back in time. Here's Richard again after a refreshing drink from the spring, despite the presence of cattle in the pasture nearby. The next day, a local farmer that I had gotten permission from to cross his land decided to walk with us for the day. He thought he knew where the trail ran, so half of the walkers followed him. I thought it followed a different route into the hills, so the other half of the group followed me. You can see evidence of the trail here, which confirmed we were on the right track. We end up waiting about an hour for the others to catch up to us on the west side of the hills. This fellow is Fred. He was a Lutheran pastor from Ontario, resting at the top of the hills. I'm showing him just to make a note that we had at least one person from out of province join us for each of the walks. Unfortunately, Fred developed some shin splints halfway through the walk, so he drove one of the support vehicles the rest of the way, which is an important task. We camped for the night at the community of Greenan, which now consists of only one building, the one-room school, which is occasionally used as a community hall. Our farmer friend had arranged for some of his neighbors to come by and share a potluck supper. And one day later, here we are with a nice view to the southeast in Fairview Community Pasture, which is in the Bad Hills. Like the first walk, we stopped at 4 communities along the way for public presentations on the history of the trail. This is in the hall at Fisk. About 30 people attended. It was also a chance for local folks to share their knowledge of and family connections to the trail. We rented the hall, we used the washrooms and kitchen, and then we slept in tents outside. At the end of day 9, we reached Herschel. It was the halfway point, and we took a day off to rest. We rented this very comfortable, fully furnished retreat house. We visited the Ancient Echoes Museum in Herschel, which has great exhibits and a nice coffee shop. And we also visited some nearby archaeological sites. Here we are with the local guide leading us to see the Herschel petroglyph, a site of spiritual importance to many indigenous groups. And our tour guide told us that this indigenous people come from the United States and Alberta to that site to pay their respects. 2 days later, a bit of rain and a surprise welcome with gifts of carrots and cinnamon buns. The woman in the blue jacket is Connie, who was a teacher at a colony near Frontier. It happened to be the sister colony to this one, so they made a nice connection. Here we are at 60 Mile Bush, another historic stopping spot along the trail. A Métis fellow named Mercier had accommodations for people and horses here, and Northwest Mounted Police constables boarded there for a few years when they patrolled the trail after 1885. That's Matthew from Montreal on the right, and that's Ken from Regina on the left. He's not quite as sinister as he looks in this photo. He's a pretty nice guy. 60 Mile Bush is 60 miles from Battleford, and this is evidence of why it got that name. We're actually walking west here for a couple of miles because the trees were so thick we had to skirt around them. By mid-afternoon, we arrived at the home of the Heather family on their farm west of Bigger. We had planned to camp there for the night, but since I had arranged a presentation at the museum in town that evening, we opted for a bed and shower at a motel instead. About 60 people came out for that presentation. Skipping ahead a few days, we stayed the night at Mosquito Grizzly Bear's Head Lean Man First Nation, south of Battleford, which is also one of the overnight stops on the trail in historic times. We were kindly treated to supper as well, but it happened to be territorial days in North Battleford that weekend, so there weren't many people around. But we did have a nice visit with a few folks. In the morning of the last day, we stopped at the site of Government House, which was capital of the Northwest Territories from 1876 to 1883. It was subsequently an Indian industrial school for 30 years. It burned down in 2003. And members of the local historical society gave us a tour and then later on treated us for lunch at Fort Battleford. We arranged for some drummers and dancers at the fort to put a wrap on the walk. And from there, we headed our separate ways. Okay, on to the third walk in 2019. It's a portion of the Carlton Trail, which ran from Winnipeg to Edmonton, or Fort Garry to Fort Edmonton at that time. So here's a map of the route, again, the green line. The walk was 180 kilometers and lasted 9 days, and there were 21 participants. We started at original Humboldt, which is an archaeological site about 6 miles southwest of Humboldt. It was the location of a telegraph station along the Carlton Trail. And this is just before we got started on our walk, and just by chance, a local Métis woman came by and shared her family history, which was connected to the trail. So it was a really nice surprise and send off for us before it got started. In 1885, Canadian militia held Chief Whitecap and his followers at this site for a while. And Whitecap was later charged with supporting the Métis and was sent to Regina for trial. On the second night, we camped at this very lovely farm, which was located at a spring that was used by people traveling the Carlton Trail in previous times. And the family still used the water from that spring for their own use. They were really great hosts, and it really, really shows that kind of gives a sense of the welcoming that we received through many of the walks, just, with complete strangers coming to your house, not knowing who was even coming. So it was a really great treat to have some families host us along the way. That night was cool, so we had a sing-along in our host's shop. He played the banjo in a local band, and Dave, the guitar player, is a singer-songwriter from Swift Current. He has walked for the past 4 years and often leads evening sing-alongs. We passed quite a few churches on this walk, and this is St. Laszlo on the next day, which is representative of the Hungarian settlement in the area. We stopped at Prudhomme for the next night. We visited the local museum, the church, and the cemetery, and enjoyed a great pizza and salad buffet at the town restaurant, which was catered just for us and some invited local folks. We rented the rink overnight for the showers, washrooms, and kitchen, and then tented outside. This is our lunch stop on the next day, a church with German heritage. We camped at Alvina that night and took an evening drive west to Torrance Coulee, also known as the site of the 1885 Battle of Fish Creek. Another day, another church, and another lunch stop. This is St. Mary's Ukrainian Catholic Church, northwest of Alvina. We camped that night at One Arrow First Nation powwow grounds. The following day, we stopped at Batoche for a short break, then continued north and crossed the river at the Saint Laurent Ferry. And here's a shot of Saint Laurent. Saint Laurent has a long history as a pilgrimage site. We stayed at the rectory, which you can see in the back there, with a morning fog coming over the South Saskatchewan River behind. And ground penetrating radar had been used to locate unmarked graves, which are since been marked with those metal crosses that you see there. I think Larry provided this photograph. Thanks, Larry. The next day, we stopped for lunch and a tour of the Duck Lake Interpretive Center. And on the last day, here we are having breakfast in the rectory. We drove west of Duck Lake to Beardy's and Okamasas First Nation, where we had left off the day before. Again, we managed to hit powwow weekend, so most of the people were in town for that. And along the road nearby, there's a National Historic Sites monument noting the Duck Lake Battle of 1885. A little further west, we stopped at Titanic Cemetery, which has mostly Métis names on the gravestones. And there was a church there at one time, but it has been demolished over the years. And heading west again for the last couple of miles to the fort. Here we are having a kind of a final photograph with smiles all around. I guess because we're finished, but it also maybe because it's downhill from here to the fort. And here's a shot of the Fort Carlton. Okay, the final trek was this last summer from Fort Ellice to Fort Qu'Appelle. It took 11 days. We walked 180 kilometers, and there were 32 participants. And just a bit of a history note, Fort Ellice was a main provisioning site for pemmican in the fur trade period. It was on the Carlton Trail and was a hub for several other trails that branched off west and northwest from there. Just make a note of the four reserves on the south side of the valley there, because they became part of our activities during the walk as well, which you'll see in a second. We camped for 2 nights at St. Lazare, which is where the Qu'Appelle River joins the Assiniboine and is close to the Fort Ellice site. Believe it or not, for those walkers, this happens to be Harold's tent. And we were greeted at the campground by Terry on the left here, who was president of the Métis local. He showed us around the Fort Ellice Interpretive Center on our second evening there. And then he and a Métis elder presented us with sashes at the Interpretive Center. They were very kind to us in many ways, so we really appreciate their. And okay, and this is the Fort Ellice site, which is on a terrace above the Assiniboine River. It's owned by the Nature Conservancy of Canada, and a community pasture adjoins it on the west side, which I got permission to cross. We had a smudge to begin the walk, led by Candace, who's standing there with the white shirt, whose home reserve is Kakawistaha along the Qu'Appelle Valley. So she was able to share some of her knowledge, having grown up in the area. And just getting started out here, a bit of bush for the first 6 miles, then another 4 miles to the Manitoba-Saskatchewan border, where we ended the first day. The next stop was at Rocanville. We camped outside the rink for 2 nights and gave a donation for use of the facilities. Here we are on the first evening. Museum volunteers picked us up for a tour of the town and the museum, complete with fiddle music on the return ride. The next overnight was at Camp McKay on Round Lake, which is part of Ochapowace First Nation. It was the site of a residential school. And these were our hosts, a band counselor with her husband and grandkids. They made us supper, and Shelley talked about the residential school and some of the band's current economic initiatives. And in addition, she presented everyone with orange t-shirts as gifts. That was a nice surprise as well. And here's Dave glamping along the lakeshore. His van is known as Dave's Diner, as he has coffee brewing and the doors open first thing in the morning. At the end of the next day's walk, we drove a few miles to Cowessess. Here we are a couple of days later in the Qu'Appelle Valley. You can see a support vehicle behind. There's also one ahead of us. And I'm just going to pause and just maybe send a shout out to Tara, Larry, and Connie, who have been faithful support vehicle drivers for several years. This is at the start of the day, so we're kind of grouped together. Usually we spread out a bit more once the walk gets going. We had lunch that day next to a Presbyterian church at Elliceboro, which was an early settlement in the valley. Before the settlement, it was known as Resette's Crossing. Resette's Crossing, which was where the trail crossed to the north side of the Qu'Appelle River near here, which we did as well. Here's a group photo as we reached Qu'Appelle Lake with 1 day to go. In this photograph, there are folks from Regina, Saskatoon, Abernethy, Meota, St. Denis, Frontier, and Swift Current. We stayed 2 nights at Camp Monaghan on Qu'Appelle Lake, and on the last day we walked to La Brette, where we toured the museum and had lunch with local folks, which is part of a regular Friday program that they have in the community. There was a memorial at the cemetery beside the cathedral. This monument was to honor Father Huguenot, who established the La Brette Indian Industrial School in 1884. But the statue of him, which was on top of this monument, and the plaque, which you can see has been removed, they were taken down last June 21st. At Fort Qu'Appelle, the walk ended at the site of the original Hudson Bay Company post. We had a quick tour of the museum there and then said our goodbyes. This marker commemorates the Qu'Appelle Valley crossing where 11 historic trails converged. So it just gives an indication of how important Fort Qu'Appelle and that area was in the early days. One of the fun things we did on the second walk to Battleford was to make up haikus. So I'm going to end the talk with this one from Richard, which sums things up very nicely. And if you want to any more details on the walks, we have some images and content on the History and Folklore Society website. So you can just go to shfs.ca, and then there's the tab that says current work. You hit that tab, there'll be a drop-down menu, and then just hit historic trails, and that'll again lead you to content on any one of the 4 walks that I've talked about today. So that ends my talk, and we'll have a chance for a few questions if anybody has any.
Very well done. Thank you so much. There's, I didn't realize there was a walking group that walked around the province. I've heard of other places in the world, but not in Saskatchewan. So bravo.
Well, thank you. It sort of evolved, naturally, because I think it was finding a need out there and a love for the land and love for history, and it just sort of grew. So we do have regulars that come out every year, but we always have new ones as well that word gets out there. So there's always new people coming along. So
great.
I'll just make a bit of a note that there's going to be a walk coming up this summer around Lake Diefenbaker. It's not going to be sponsored by Saskatchewan History and Folklore Society, but if anybody's interested in joining us, there will be details posted later on once they're finalized, probably getting towards late spring. Again, it's not going to be a trail so much as just kind of exploring the landscape and some of the history around Lake Diefenbaker. And then 2 years from now, looking at maybe doing the northwest or the, I guess, maybe west central part of the province, probably walking from Battleford to Fort Pitt, which would be about an 11-day walk. But again, that's just sort of in the distance planning stage.
We've got a question in the chat, but what did the dispatch to Fort Walsh say?
Nothing very profound at all. It's just that I had actually wrote it, and just the RCMP at Assiniboia just handed it to me. Just sort of there were no cameras to record the event. But I just said I know something to the effect that these 2 deputized Northwest Mounted Police are just scouted the trail and are here to report that all is well along the trail. Something to that effect.
How do you know ahead of time? Like, how do you arrange the land?
Was it, I mean, staying at farmers' place?
Yeah, and just the path. Who owns what, and how do you know?
Yeah, that takes a bit of research. I've got a map, and you can also go on the internet in some cases to find where the historic trails actually ran. So I sometimes just transcribe those on current RM maps, and then we try to walk as close as possible. Obviously, I mean, they're not following the road allowances, which came up later, but I try to keep as close as possible to the actual trail to keep it as authentic as possible. So I just did the research and plot out the route based on what that main factor, staying close to the trail, but also have to consider where to spend the night. And like I mentioned in that first walk, we spent 7 or 8 farmers, ranchers that I arranged to make stay overnight. Probably the same thing for the Swift Battleford trail walk. But in this last one, we didn't stay at any farmers' places. We felt it was more convenient just to drive at the end of the day's walk, just to drive to the locals community, like Broadview and Grenfell, for example. I mentioned Rocanville there. So we actually, this last year, spent 2 nights at each location, as opposed to the first couple of walks where we're kind of moving things ahead every day as we went. So this, I think this style is much more relaxed, and people seem to enjoy it kind of like going back and not having to pack up their tent every morning. So that's probably the method we're going to follow from now on. Also, I mean, when I started approaching farmers and ranchers about staying at their location too, obviously I'm a total stranger to them, and so they want to know like how many people we're talking about, and I could give them a ballpark the first couple of walks because I had a better handle on things. But since we've been advertising the walks more in the last couple of walks, it was a bit harder to gauge who might be coming, showing up on any one of the days, because I wasn't necessarily asking people to register ahead of time. I encouraged them to, but I had the routes posted and the stopping and starting spots posted, so people were invited to join us for half a day or a day as it suited their schedule and location where they're coming from. So
We've got another chat question here. How many kilometers did you walk each day?
yeah, about 20 kilometers. I didn't get openly swore at too many times. Sometimes I cheat a little bit on that when I said we're going to. I usually use miles because the maps I'm using are, of course, and the roads are always obviously are surveyed in miles. So usually it's 10 to 14 miles. Pardon me. Well, 10's on the low end. 12 to 14 miles is a normal, and I try to keep it to 12 or 13. So that translates into 20, 21, 22 kilometers.
So how would your day look like? What would be a typical schedule for walking?
Yeah, very relaxed in the morning, and that grates on some people because some people like to have their poached eggs and things in the morning. So we're usually not in too much of a rush to get going in the morning, and we don't necessarily need to because that 20 kilometers you can do in 4.5 hours. So typically we wouldn't get started walking till about 10:30, and we might be done by 3:30 in the afternoon, depending on how many stops along the way. And if it's a hot day, you probably want more breaks on the way. So it's quite relaxed, and then of course that gives you time to get back to like we had to move vehicles ahead, as I mentioned, the first couple of walks, but it gives you a chance to do that, and then or go back to where you're staying for that night, and then lots of time for getting ready for supper and relaxing in the evening or whatever. We sing some songs around the fire, that sort of thing. So it's very focused. Like say 10:30 to 4 o'clock is kind of the start and finish.
I wonder if I can jump in for a minute, Hugh. It's
Hi,
Richard.
Richard. Hi, Richard.
Hi, how are you doing? You're doing well here. Anyway, I'm just wanted to say that a lasting impression I have of having done the walks with you is what a dry part of the world we live in. It's it's deemed semi-arid, and indeed it is, and we live in these oases that is our cities that rely on outlying lakes, for our water supply and our trees, I think. But what a dry place we live in. And overall, walking is just such a wonderful way to feel like you're truly of the prairie. And until I started doing these with you in 2015, I don't think I had that. I was an urban dweller. And also I wanted to mention that that walking 20 kilometers a day is, and repeatedly for day after day, is the closest comparison I have is my, somewhat limited, but anyway, remarkable experience of Indian ceremonies, First Nations ceremonies, I guess, politically correct term. But which, through 3 days you might fast from water and food, and it puts you in another state. Well, walking 9, or as you have 16, 17 days, puts you into a state of awareness, and it is both fatigue and exhaustion, but also, I can recall on our walk from Saskatchewan to Battleford, stopping by the side of the road to greet a couple of wild roses that were fluttering there in the breeze, and just by the very side of the road, which is mercifully also marked by wild portulaca, which is softer to walk on than gravel. But the wild roses, just to say, what are you doing here? You're so beautiful. You know, they were just gorgeous. And I was probably under the influence of several days of walking. So I just wanted to share that with you listeners, that there is something truly spiritual and connecting about these walks and these endeavors. And then, of course, there is the community of being together with others. So it's been nice to even make this small connection with people midwinter. Okay, enough words.
Yeah, thanks, Richard.
That's what it is. Thank you.
Huh. Well, thanks everybody for coming. It's a good presentation.
All right, and I'll say my thanks as well for tuning in. And again, if you're interested in the walks, you can contact the History and Folklore Society office. They'll put you in contact with me, and we can maybe have you along if you haven't been already. Okay, bye.